It'd be easy for me to brag on this morning's guest, but one of his law clerks does a heck of a lot better job when she said, he is very busy, but he loves people. He knows no station in life. He is always very inquisitive, whoever you are. You have something he wants to know about. Who is he? You'll meet him coming up next on Carolina People. Good morning. Welcome to Carolina People. This morning we're at the Fox 43 studio. We're focused on the United States Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces, and we're visiting with its former Chief Judge, Robinson Oscar Everett. Good morning, Chief Judge Everett.
Hello, Greg.
Great to be with you. Dad is another name I know you by. That's right. You know, of course, you were with us just a handful of months ago, Dad. It's kind of funny to get you down to the studio this regularly.
Well, you know, it's sort of funny, a coincidence. I was here with a famous novelist, Mickey Spillane, the last time, during that same week.
That's right.
And this time, it's the same week as a novelist who soon will be famous.
Well, is already famous if you've been to some of the multiple websites. Of course, he's coming in on Wednesday, Thursday, and I think we're going to try to convince him to stay in Friday as well.
That'll be great. Gene Sullivan will be a tremendous asset.
Of course, not only a big asset for us to get him on the show, but he was a big asset for the Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces.
I agree. For 15 years, 16 years he was there. Part of the time as Chief Judge, he was my successor. A great guy, a great judge, a great novelist.
Have you read the book, Dan?
I have.
The Majority Rules?
I have.
Can you share with the viewers a little bit to get them excited for later in the week without giving away any? I mean, you know, you've seen the inside jacket cover. What's the book about?
Well, the book is about judges, for one thing, but it's also about murder, sex, violence, you name it, a spy agency, all sorts of things. You know, everybody wonders who's who in that book. It's sort of like, I was up in Asheville the other day. It went by Thomas Wolfe's home, the memorial there.
Right.
And they were talking about his book, Look Homeward Angel, and how after he wrote it, he didn't come back to Asheville for 7 years because he was afraid of the reaction from people who obviously were depicted there. Well, I've always wondered whether the chief judge in Gene's book, who is a sort of soft-spoken Southerner rambling around, whether I'm that guy. So I speculate on that, but I'm sure there's some other people on the staff who wonder if they're the people who are being mentioned in this novel.
Oh,
maybe that adds to the zest for me, but
absolutely.
It's a great novel.
The excitement for everyone, and of course to go through that and to think of a real hero there, and of course we're looking forward to learn more about it and the steps in going through it. But when you were on the bench with Gene, did you ever have inklings that he was planning something bigger after leaving the bench?
Not really. I knew he was planning a lot of things, and I think he was very committed to his life of judicial service and didn't think about other things very much because he was really centered on that. But I must admit I was amazed when I learned he had written a novel. I didn't know he was interested in doing that. In my own case, I've tried to write a couple of TV things, but I haven't had the success that Gene has had.
Time will come, Dad. Absolutely.
Time will come.
Time will come. You know, or time will tell even, but time, it takes time. It takes time, and I'm sure Gene put a lot of time into that, planning that out.
I think he said he had 4 or 5 years that he was working on it, and he had an editor right there under his own roof. His wife Lisa helped him quite a bit with it, and it's a tremendous product there.
Well, now I Googled Chief Judge Sullivan last night, did a little research on him, and I saw that he had recently given a talk at Duke Law School. He had recently been to visit with a group of students there. It looks like a big crowd. What was that all about?
Well, at Duke at the law school, I teach there, of course, we have visitors come in periodically for informal sessions, and I arranged for Gene to come for that and just talk informally and meet the students. Also, while he was there, he met with some members of the Christian Legal Society. They were interested in meeting him. He had a book signing at a bookstore in Durham, the Regulator, and talked to a civic club, the Kiwanis Club. Each time he had an interesting description of what's involved in writing a book. And he said everybody has a book inside them, and he inspired me so much that I've been thinking what book I'm going to write now.
Yeah, I want to know that.
I don't think it'll be a novel.
Really?
Yeah, but maybe I'll write one about my 3 sons.
Even better. How about your middle son? That's good.
We'll focus on the middle son.
Yeah. Well, of course, share with the viewers a little bit about what your youngest son's been doing.
Well, for the past 8 or 9 months, he has been transcribing a diary that was compiled by my father, his grandfather, between 1915 and 1970, just before my father died.
1915 to 1970 for 55 years?
55 years. And he did it almost weekly. He would reflect on what had happened the week before and what might happen in the week ahead or the weeks ahead. It's a very interesting document. Luke has gotten from 1915 to 1952 or 3. I've gotten up to about 1938 or 39. And it's fascinating because Father was in the middle of a whole lot of things. He served in the legislature in North Carolina for several terms. While serving there, he introduced some rather significant and rather controversial legislation. For example, the anti-hooding legislation in North Carolina.
When you say the anti-hooding legislation, you mean that's regarding the Ku Klux Klan?
Well, I guess basically that was it. Apparently they were not very happy about it, and I remember his telling me about that, but that at least is recorded. He handled some very interesting cases, death cases. One famous case, at least back in the 20s it was famous, involving anti-Semitism, where he was protecting the rights of a Jewish shopkeeper. He was in the middle of a lot of things, and I think that was his nature to try to help the underdog. So I'm looking forward to seeing, reading the rest of it, and I think ultimately that diary will, in some form, be a book, and it will be on a website as transcribed, so it will be available for historians. Mm-hmm. I think it could be very important. So that's what Luke's been doing.
Luke has been transcribing it, and you said he is at what year now?
He's reached 1951 or 2.
Okay, good. So he's got another 20 years more or less.
I don't know whether the length of the diary shortens as my dad got older, or whether it lengthens. I don't know whether he wrote more or less each week, but there's another 15, 20 years to be printed out, and he does a little bit of editing. There's some of it that's illegible. You've heard of hieroglyphics. Mm-hmm. Well, my dad had a form of hieroglyphics, and Luke had to break the code, and I think he finally did and was able to transcribe it. I had several other people I'd asked to try it, and they'd start in and get discouraged, and Luke volunteered to take a year out of his life and do it. I really appreciated it.
Absolutely. It's a great commitment. Speaking of, we're talking about your dad. Did your mother ever keep a diary?
No, she didn't.
Really?
She was involved in an oral interview for UNC History, and I have read that interview, which is very fascinating. Mm-hmm. She was unique in many ways, one of them being she was one of the first women lawyers in North Carolina. Mm-hmm. And there weren't that many women lawyers around anywhere in the United States at that time. So she had a lot of people interested in what she was doing. She went to the University of North Carolina for her last year of law school. Right. I think she'd done some studies before. Right. And she graduated in 1920. I was reminded of that when I was up in Asheville, because she and Tom Wolfe used to eat at the same boarding house.
Oh, you're kidding.
And she had described him to me a little bit, tall guy, 6'6" or something like that. And,
Right.
he was just completing college and she was just completing law school, so they had something in common. Then she was the first woman in North Carolina to argue and win an appeal in the North Carolina Supreme Court.
Right.
And it was so unusual for women to be trying cases in those days that, as she described it, there was usually a crowd present when she'd try a case, because people just hadn't seen women lawyers try cases.
They'd flock from, I remember that phrase, they'd flock from miles around to see a woman try a case.
And one of the other things that's sort of interesting, in those days, women wore hats quite a bit. In social gatherings, they wear the hat while they were there, indoors. And so when she argued that case in the Supreme Court, she asked the Chief Justice, should she wear a hat or not? And basically, I think he said, you make the choice. And she did not wear a hat, and no woman has worn a hat arguing a case in the North Carolina Supreme Court since then. I don't know how they do it in South Carolina, probably the same way, and I don't know how many women lawyers they have in South Carolina. But that was quite a breakthrough. Then she became the vice president of the North Carolina Bar Association, and was active in that, and lo and behold, at one of their bar meetings, when they were planning a trip to London, the American bar was going over for the first time. She met a young lawyer, well, not that young, he was about
15 years
older than she was, namely my dad. And that indirectly led to their getting married 2 years later. So you see, there's a lot of real value in being a member of a bar association.
That's right.
You meet some interesting people.
You've passed that interest on to your first and third born, and one of your daughters-in-law. Speaking about being members of the bar, I guess 3.5 years from now they'll be members of the North Carolina bar.
Hopefully, they're all starting law school this fall.
At which law school?
UNC Law School in Chapel Hill.
In their grandmother's footsteps. Wow.
Right. In fact, the law library there is named for her.
That's right.
So they can go study and look up at her portrait.
That would be very exciting. Well, of course, we talked about your mother. We talked about your dad. Did you ever keep a diary?
No.
Did you ever think about keeping one, knowing your dad was writing one?
No, absolutely not.
Why not?
I guess I was too lazy.
Yeah.
Also, I don't write very well.
You've got that hieroglyphics like your dad, which is amazing.
Yeah, I picked that up from him. No, I, for some reason, never wanted to write a diary. I would like to write a novel like Gene Sullivan. I don't think I'm capable of that. I'm now thinking of trying to do something sort of autobiographical, but try to tie it in with some biography of my parents, sort of lawyer family, what it's like to have two parents who are lawyers and then get started in the same field.
That could be very interesting. Of course, you pointed out 1920, big year for your mother arguing and winning. First woman to argue and win a case in the North Carolina Supreme Court. You didn't point out, of course, that aspect of it being a big year for women in general.
Oh, she got the right to vote that year.
The right to vote. But that other key aspect, interestingly, that so many folks talk about is being the only woman in the class, in her law school class at Chapel Hill, and being #1 in her class.
That is right. She was #1 in her class, and then when she took the bar exam, the Chief Justice wrote her father, who had been a lawyer, and whom he knew, and said, your daughter, Catherine's bar exam was not only the best this year of any, but one of the best we've ever had. She was off to a good start.
She was.
I wish I'd inherited some of that skill.
You got a couple of those, Dad. Share with the viewers a little about growing up in Durham. What was that like? Obviously, our focus on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces, and if we run out of time, maybe we convince you to come back and spend a little time with us tomorrow. We really want to get into the Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces, but what was it like growing up in Durham? And obviously, you know, most of our viewers are in the PD and southeastern North Carolina, so there's a causal connection to the Tar Heel State, and obviously everyone in South Carolina feels some commonality there. What was it like growing up in Durham, North Carolina?
Well, at that time, Duke was just starting its rise. My parents had a lot of associations with Duke faculty, so I had a lot of exposure to Duke. My dad was one of the first 5 students who had read law at Trinity College, the predecessor of Duke. And so being in that partly university community was very important. We were 15 miles from Chapel Hill, and so we had the benefit of UNC being close at hand.
Right.
Nobody had spoken of the triangle at that time, but Durham was bigger than Raleigh.
Really?
Considerably bigger.
This would have been in the 30s and...
Yeah, up at, well, in 1950, I think Durham had more people than Raleigh and almost as many as Greensboro. I mentioned Thomas Wolfe a moment ago.
Right.
He writes about Durham in Look Home with Angel, except he called it Exeter. And Exeter was apparently sort of a slum with a bunch of drunks and everything. A lot of people had an uncomplimentary view of Durham, but it was a very thriving city.
Why?
I don't know why. I guess it was a factory town in part, and that maybe people out of the country just didn't think much of people working in the cities in factories. I don't know, but I've always loved Durham. It had great high schools. The Durham High School was probably the leading one in North Carolina.
Really?
The odor of tobacco was everywhere. You'd go near the tobacco factories and you could smell tobacco. So I never smoked, but I sure got exposed to tobacco. I thought it was a very friendly town. The relations between whites and blacks, I think, were better in Durham than in many other southern communities. Interestingly, the African American community in Durham was one of the first to really organize itself and be politically active. So that was something significant.
What do you think motivated that? What do you think enabled that to happen?
I don't know, but there were some very creative people that created the institution that's now North Carolina Central. It had a different name then, but Dr. Shepard had this vision of creating this particular college for blacks, for African Americans, and he carried that forward. One of the first major African American businesses started in Durham, North Carolina Mutual,
right,
which at one point was the largest private black financial institution in the country. I think actually largest African American business in the country, and so that was a very significant feature of Durham's background. I think in some ways it was parallel to Atlanta in that regard, the black community rising economically more than they had in some other cities. But Durham was a great place to be, and I was an only child, so I got probably more exposure to things. My parents would take me to different things, and they might not have done so had there been several kids.
As a child, did you always plan to be a lawyer because your mom and dad were?
No, not at all.
Really?
I really applied to law school at the last minute. I was at Harvard. I'd originally been at UNC and then went up there. And one of my friends said, well, I'm walking over to the Harvard Law School today. Would you like to walk over with me? Have you ever seen it? And I had not seen it, so I said, I'll walk over with you. And on the way, I said, what are you going over for? He said, I'm going to apply to law school. And I thought, I don't have a job. I have no particular future plans. I'm a senior in college. Maybe I'd better think out something pretty quick. Maybe I should apply to law school. This was right after World War II. I was very young then, and most of the other people around me were several years older and had been veterans. So I really hadn't done the planning I probably should have. But I went over and applied, was admitted soon thereafter, and went on to law school and have loved it ever since.
Now, you're leaving out some key. I mean, you obviously did. I mean, you worked hard in law school, did very well in law school. Of course, you'd moved. When you say you're very young, you were a senior in college, but you were 19.
I think I graduated at 19 and finished law school at 22.
Which is pretty, and I think I'm correct, fourth in a class of 445. So,
I think you're correct, too,
yeah,
but
yeah.
I'm not sure.
Not doing too bad there, not too shabby there in law school, which probably helped set the stage. I mean, but you really had not thought about being a lawyer. Again, at 19, I mean, you're so dang young, but...
You know what I wanted to be?
What?
A detective.
Really?
I'd read a lot of detective novels, and I wanted to be a detective.
Huh.
Also
Mickey
a police
Spillane would
officer.
like to hear that, yeah.
Yeah, police officer. I like that sort of thing.
You wanted to be a police officer, possibly.
Then I worked up to the idea of being a detective.
I wonder what you would have done. You could have been a good plot summary for Chief Judge Sullivan, you know, helping plan out the majority rules there. I didn't know that interest in being a detective.
Yeah. All sorts of things in my background.
Did your parents encourage you to look at the law, or, I mean, was it truly...
They probably wanted me to, but they followed the very wise tactic of not forcing me into something. Mm-hmm. And they took me to bar meetings. When I was 11 years old, my mother and I we went on Greyhound or Trailways buses out to San Francisco, where she attended a bar meeting. So I saw a lot of lawyers, and a lot of times judges would come have lunch at our home. They were on circuit. Right. They knew my parents, and in those days it was quite customary for lawyers to invite judges who were visiting to have a meal in their home. Nobody thought that was inappropriate. Now that's very seldom done, if at all. And my grandfather was a lawyer, so I was exposed to some of the older lawyers. I had a lot of respect for lawyers. I just hadn't planned it through to be one.
We've just got a couple of minutes. You know, when you think about, I know you've taught at Duke University at the law school for many years.
Over 45.
I think it's, a good while, absolutely. Can you share with viewers how that came about?
Oh, there apparently was a vacancy on the faculty rather unexpectedly. They had a fairly young member of the faculty who went elsewhere. The university counsel was a friend of my dad. He had the impression that I was doing reasonably well at law school, and I was on the law review and had done rather well. So they needed somebody to fill in, and he asked my dad if I might be interested in that. And I had interviewed with some firms, but I pretty well decided I wanted to go home to Durham, and I would practice with my mother and dad. I thought they would let me practice with them, and I think they would have. But this opportunity came up, and my father thought that would be a great idea for me, and that I might enjoy some academic exposure.
Right.
And so I signed up for it. I was interviewed by the acting dean of the law school and by some other people, and I had the job.
You know, I saw the other day, maybe it was a Duke Law website or it was somewhere else, highlighting the fact that not only at that time in 1950 were you the youngest faculty member ever hired at age 22, but to the present, you still hold the record for having been the youngest hired professor at the Duke Law School at age 22. That must have been a little strange when most law students, we just got a couple of minutes, we got to wrap, but when most law students were 23, 24, 25.
Most of them were veterans who had come
And then
back.
many of them were veterans even older.
Yeah.
And you're age 22 as their professor. That must have been nuts.
That's tough. That's tough. And you don't know really how, it was very hard to handle. Everybody treated me with great respect, but, you know, if I were a 25, 28-year-old veteran or something, and here's this young guy, 22, my teacher, I'd feel a little bit strange. So, and I could understand how they felt. Also, it was a little bit difficult to get dates, you know, because as a professor, you feel a little strange if you're calling some co-ed on the campus and asking for a date. Yeah. Fortunately, I had a cousin who was a law student, and he helped me a little bit in that regard.
Oh, yes.
He was an intermediary.
We want to talk about that cousin and a little bit more about Duke Law School and, of course, focus on the Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces. Would you be willing to come back and spend a little time with us tomorrow?
Anytime you invite me, I'm right here. I'll love to do it.
Dad, okay. Fantastic. Stay tuned to more Carolina People with Chief Judge Robinson Everett coming up next. In September 1950, Robinson Everett joined the law faculty at Duke University at the age of 22. At the age of 22, he took 5 years off, was in the Air Force, served in the Korean War. I mean, the excitement of being out for a little while. Coming back in 1956 after 5 years, started on part-time. Next year he'll be there 50 years straight. He doesn't like to highlight that 50 years, but it's going to be a big day up there in Durham and throughout, as so many of his students and colleagues think about 50 years of time in the same place. The excitement, if you've been here the last 30 minutes, you'd see that for him. We'll learn more about it tomorrow. I come back for part 2 of Robinson Everett.